Throughout the years, the Final Fantasy series has become one of the best-selling and most recognizable video game franchises of all time. It has amassed almost 100 separate titles and has millions of fans since its inception in 1987. One of its most popular aspects are its summonable creatures like Bahamut, Shiva, and Odin. These summons were first introduced as magical abilities for the Summoner, Evoker, and Sage job classes in 1990's Final Fantasy III for the Nintendo Famicom and would become a staple of the franchise, even helping to define what being a Final Fantasy game really meant. Countless different summons have been created for the series over the years, with over 50 separate creatures appearing as summoning magic. These creatures were not all completely original though, with many taking their names or potential inspiration from real-life objects, religious figures, mythology, and folklore. In this video, we'll be taking a look at where these possible inspirations came from and their place in real-world lore. When it comes to ancient mythology and folklore, there are often many different translations and interpretations of what the stories and texts actually mean or what they are referring to. In this video, we'll often be focusing on the more popular and widely accepted interpretations. I also apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Let's take a look at the real-life lore behind Final Fantasy's large array of summonable creatures. One of the most well-known summons in the Final Fantasy series is Ifrit, a fire elemental creature first appearing in Final Fantasy III. Ifrit's origins are rooted in Arabic folklore and the religion of Islam. Its earliest mentions are in the phrase Ifrit of the Jinn, found in the Quran and the Hadith, two of the most sacred scriptures in the Islamic faith. Unlike in the Final Fantasy games, the Ifrit found in Arabic folklore refers to multiple beings instead of just an individual creature. They are seen as rebellious members of the Jinn, powerful yet mischievous supernatural beings found throughout Islamic writings and Arabic folklore. In fact, the North American version of Final Fantasy IV and Ifrit's first appearance outside of Japan even changed its name to Jinn. Jinn are more commonly referred to as genies in other parts of the world, with many modern movies and stories often depicting them as wish-granting entities trapped in lamps. The Ifrit eventually became mainstays in Arabic folklore, with their traits and characteristics being fleshed out and expanded on as time went on. Like many mythological beings, these traits and characteristics would change and evolve depending on which group, country, or religious sect you asked. While not every single Ifrit is considered bad or villainous, most are depicted as being evil and nefarious, as well as strong, rebellious, meddlesome, and destructive. Many texts describe them as beings formed of smoke and fire that live underground and can be of either male or female gender. Some groups view the Ifrit as powerful demonic beings, even stronger than the Jinn, that often have very intense attributes like claws on their hands, burning eyes, and even multiple heads. Others see them less as Jinn or demons and more as spirits from the departed souls of humans. It is also believed by many that the Ifrit can possess humans, making them stronger and more courageous, but eventually driving them insane. The Final Fantasy series has depicted Ifrit in many different forms. Some are a bit more human-looking, while others are closer to that of a monster or demon, featuring scaly skin, horns, claw-like hands, and flaming eyes. While the Final Fantasy series has helped establish Ifrit much more in modern society around the world, the entity has also appeared in other video and tabletop games, novels, movies, and TV shows. The Ifrit also appear in various stories in the incredibly well-known Arabic collection of folktales, 1001 Nights. Ifrit's representation in Final Fantasy is often one of rebellious nature, great power, and smoke and flames, staying mostly true to its folklore counterparts. The next summon we'll be talking about, however, strays much further away from the lore which it is originally based on. While Ifrit's earliest roots are set in Islam, Final Fantasy's popular ice elemental summon, Shiva, originates from a completely different religion, Hinduism. In all sects of Hinduism, Shiva is a deity that is worshipped and revered by all. Much different than Final Fantasy's depiction though, Shiva is almost always portrayed as a male and has little to do specifically with ice. While most Hindu religious sects acknowledge Shiva as a deity, Shaivism sees him as the supreme being that is everything and everywhere, the creator and the destroyer. Other practices of Hinduism believe Shiva shares the balance with other deities like Vishnu, Brahma, Parvati, and Ganesha, though these beliefs generally vary quite a bit depending on the sect. Shiva often has many defining attributes and features when he is depicted, like a third eye on his forehead, matted hair, ashes covering his body, and a serpent hanging from his shoulders. He also has a blue, bruise-like coloring on his neck, representing when he drank a deadly poison. The poison had been churned from the ocean by demigods hoping to achieve immortality, and would have destroyed the world if it had not been nullified. It was stopped from going to his stomach by Shiva's wife, Parvati, who gripped his neck to hold the poison in his throat, which eventually turned it blue. Shiva is sometimes portrayed in pieces of art with his skin being completely blue, but according to texts, it is only his neck that is of this color. Outside of sharing the same name, the blue skin depictions are really the only other common trait between the deity and the in-game summon, and was most likely the inspiration behind the Final Fantasy design. There has also been speculation that Shiva's name, pronounced as Shiva in Japanese, was derived from the Queen of Shiva, a Middle Eastern queen who appears in the Hebrew Bible bringing many valuable gifts for Solomon, the king of Israel. Just like Hinduism's Shiva though, the Queen of Sheba has no specific relation to ice. While the next summon's real-life roots are possibly even more ambiguous than Shiva's, they are hypothesized to be tied to either Hinduism or Mesopotamian folklore. Ramuh, the main lightning elemental summon in Final Fantasy, is generally portrayed as an old man with a massive beard and an ornate staff. Just like Ifrit in Shiva, he first appears in 1990's Final Fantasy III. One of Ramuh's possible inspirations comes from the folklore of the ancient civilization Mesopotamia. In Babylonia, a state within Mesopotamia, it is believed that Abzu, a deity made of fresh water, and Tiamat, a god made of salt water, became lovers and gave birth to a son named Ramuh, alongside a female counterpart named Lahamu. The actual lore behind Ramuh is very vague, and he is sometimes referred to as multiple beings, similar to the Ifrit in Arabic lore. Ramuh is also often portrayed as a bearded man, which lines up with his design in the Final Fantasy games. In Japanese, Ramuh would be pronounced as Ramu, which lends extra proof to their connection. Unlike its Final Fantasy counterpart though, Ramuh would be seen as a water deity or a guardian of the sea and lacks any relation to lightning or thunder. Another possible connection to Ramuh's name is the Hebrew word Raham, found in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which translates to thunder. Strangely, when Ramuh and summon magic in general were first introduced to North America in Final Fantasy IV, originally titled Final Fantasy II, his name was changed to Indra. Indra is a mythological deity in Hinduism that is associated with lightning, thunder, and storms. He is generally portrayed riding a large elephant and wielding a thunderbolt-shaped weapon called Vajra. One final theory is that Ramuh's name comes from another piece of Hindu writing, a poem titled Ramayana. Its story's main character is a prince named Rama, who embodies the Hindu god Vishnu. Some people think Ramuh's name is simply a portmanteau of Rama and Vishnu, though this theory seems a bit more far-fetched compared to the others. Funnily enough, the brief North American name changed to Indra makes much more sense overall compared to Ramuh's other possible derivations. While these first three summon entities were all connected to a certain element and initially appeared in the third mainline Final Fantasy title, the next did not have a specific elemental link and was first introduced in the series' debut entry. The summon probably most closely associated with the Final Fantasy franchise is Bahamut, a massive dragon-like creature that generally causes non-elemental damage to its target. While Bahamut did not appear as a summon until Final Fantasy III alongside the previous three entries we've covered, it did show up in the very first game in the series and even received its own spin-off title called Bahamut Lagoon for Nintendo's Super Famicom. Its main inspiration and design comes from the dragon of the same name found in the fantasy tabletop RPG franchise Dungeons & Dragons, specifically the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. In D&D, Bahamut is seen as the king of all dragons and one that despises all evil acts and entities. Its nemesis and archrival is the villainous five-headed female dragon, Tiamat, who coincidentally also appears alongside Bahamut in the very first Final Fantasy. Much like Ifrit, Bahamut's roots are also set in early Arabic mythology. It is often portrayed as an enormous fish or fish-like sea creature suspended in water that acts as the main pillar which holds up the 7 stages of the earth. Upon its back stands Kujata, a massive bull that also appears as a summon in later Final Fantasy games. On top of Kujata's back is a mountain made of ruby, and at the peak of the mountain sits an angel who holds the earth's 7 stages. Bahamut's portrayal, like many of the other entities we've covered, can sometimes differ slightly depending on the translations and interpretations from the ancient texts it is pulled from. Some experts even believe the Bahamut's name is derived from the biblical creature called the Behemoth, yet another staple of the Final Fantasy series. That's it for part 1 of the real-world lore behind Final Fantasy's summons. In the next part, we'll be looking at some of the series' other, very early and more popular summons like Odin and Leviathan. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe even learned something new from it. Please consider subscribing if you're interested in checking out future videos. Thanks for watching and see you next time.